The air was crisp that November morning, the kind that carried the scent of damp leaves and the promise of approaching winter. Rome, Georgia, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, was waking up slowly under a pale, overcast sky. The sun barely peeked through the thick canopy of skeletal trees that lined the edges of a quiet, winding creek just outside the city limits. It was here in the murky, shallow waters of that creek that Officer Daniel Mercer spotted something that didn't belong. The metallic glint of a vehicle's roof caught his eye through the tangle of bare branches. He slowed his patrol car, pulling onto the shoulder of the deserted road that ran parallel to the creek. His breath misted in the air as he stepped out, boots crunching against the frost-kissed grass. The vehicle, a silver Ford Focus, sat partially submerged, its front end angled downward where the water deepened. The current lapped lazily against the tires, whispering secrets that only the forest could hear. Mercer's heart picked up its pace. An abandoned car? Out here? This wasn't a place people parked for a leisurely stroll. The location was remote, miles from the nearest house, and the way the vehicle was positioned suggested it hadn't simply rolled into the water by accident. The driver's side door was closed, the windows intact, no shattered glass, no sign of a struggle. He radioed it in. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer. I've got an abandoned vehicle out on Old Mill Road about a quarter mile past the bridge. Silver Ford Focus, partially submerged in the creek." Static crackled before a voice responded. "Any sign of an occupant?" Mercer moved closer, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He pressed his palm against the hood of the car. Cold. Too cold for it to have been running recently. Peering through the driver's side window, he saw nothing but an empty seat. No keys, no phone, just a few stray receipts and an empty coffee cup in the console. The air inside smelled of something faintly metallic, a scent he couldn't quite place. "No sign of a driver," Mercer replied. "Requesting backup. Gonna check the area." "Copy that. Sending another unit your way." Mercer took a deep breath and turned his attention to the surrounding woods. He scanned for footprints, tire tracks, any indication that someone had left the vehicle on foot. But the earth was firm, undisturbed except for the occasional animal track. The road, too, was mostly dry. If the driver had walked away, there was no telling which direction they had gone. The second patrol car arrived within minutes. Officer Rebecca Hayes stepped out, zipping up her jacket against the chill. "What do we have?" she asked, hands tucked into her pockets. "Ford Focus, abandoned in the creek," Mercer said. "No driver, no immediate sign of foul play, but it's an odd place to leave a car." Hayes nodded, stepping closer to examine the vehicle. "Plates registered to someone? Running it now." Mercer tapped into the department's database, fingers quick against the screen of his mobile terminal. Within seconds, the name appeared. "Ethan Sullivan," Mercer read aloud. "Age 22, local address." Hayes frowned. "That name sounds familiar. Didn't he just graduate from Berry College?" "I think so." A heavy silence settled between them. It wasn't unusual for cars to be found abandoned, but there was something about this one that felt different. The location, the lack of personal belongings, the eerie stillness of the surrounding woods. "We should contact his family," Hayes said finally. Mercer nodded. "I'll take it." He dialed the number listed under emergency contacts. The phone rang 3 times before a man's voice, rough with concern, answered. "Hello? Mr. Sullivan?" Mercer asked, his tone gentle but firm. "Yes." "This is Officer Daniel Mercer with the Rome Police Department. Sir, we've found a vehicle registered to your son, Ethan Sullivan. It was located abandoned in a creek off Old Mill Road. We were hoping you might know his whereabouts." "My son?" The voice wavered slightly. I haven't heard from Ethan since yesterday afternoon. He was supposed to be meeting a friend for dinner, but when I called later, he didn't pick up. I assumed he'd just gotten busy." Mercer exchanged a glance with Hayes. "Do you know if he mentioned going anywhere unusual?" "No, nothing like that," Mr. Sullivan said. "Officer, is he?" "No sign of him in or around the vehicle," reassured him. "But we're starting an investigation. If you think of anything that might help us locate him, please let us know." "I will." The call ended, but the unease lingered. Hayes exhaled, rubbing her arms. This doesn't feel right. Mercer nodded in agreement. Something was very wrong, and Ethan Sullivan was nowhere to be found. The late autumn air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter. The trees stood bare, their skeletal branches swaying gently in the breeze as the last of the golden leaves clung stubbornly to the limbs. The quiet streets of Rome, Georgia seemed unassuming, unaware that a mystery was unfolding within its borders. Ethan Sullivan was last seen visiting his best friend, Logan Mitchell, on the evening of November 10, 2022. The two had been inseparable since high school, their bond forged through years of shared experiences. Late-night drives, camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and whispered conversations about the future. But now, Ethan was missing, and the last person to see him was Logan. It was around 6:30 p.m. when Ethan pulled up to Logan's house, a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch. The porch light flickered as Logan stepped outside to greet him, the two exchanging a casual hug before retreating inside. Logan's parents were out for the evening, giving them free rein over the house. They ordered takeout, sprawled across the living room floor, and reminisced about the past while watching old episodes of their favorite sitcoms. He seemed fine, Logan later told the police. I mean, nothing seemed off. He wasn't acting strange or anything. We were just catching up. But something had changed, even if Logan hadn't noticed it at the time. Around 9:45 p.m., Ethan received a text message. Logan didn't see who it was from, but he noticed the shift in Ethan's expression. His relaxed demeanor tightened, his brow furrowed, and his fingers hovered over the screen as if contemplating a response. "Everything okay?" Logan had asked. "Yeah," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. "I should probably head out soon, though." 15 minutes later, Ethan stood by the door, keys in hand. "I'll text you tomorrow," he promised before stepping into the cool night air. Logan watched as Ethan's Ford Focus disappeared down the dimly lit street, the taillights casting long shadows against the pavement. That was the last time anyone saw him. The next morning, Ethan's parents grew concerned when he didn't answer their calls. At first, they assumed he had simply slept in, exhausted from a late night. But as hours passed with no response, their worry deepened. By noon, his mother, Rachel Sullivan, had a sinking feeling in her stomach. "This isn't like him," she told her husband, Greg. "He always calls back." Greg dialed Logan's number, hoping for answers. Logan's voice on the other end was hesitant, confused. "He left my place around 10, he said. I haven't heard from him since." Panic set in. By early evening, Ethan's parents drove to the police station, filing an official missing person report. Officer Daniel Mercer, already aware of the abandoned Ford Focus found in the creek, immediately connected the two cases. A missing young man and his deserted car. It was too much of a coincidence. Detectives arrived at Logan's house later that night, combing through every detail of Ethan's last known movements. Logan sat at the kitchen table, fingers interlocked, recounting the evening again and again as if saying it out loud would make sense of it. "Did Ethan mention anything unusual?" Detective Harper asked, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. "No," Logan said. "Like I told you before, he was acting normal until he got that text." "Do you know who it was from?" "No idea. He didn't say." Detective Harper exchanged a glance with Mercer. A text message, a shift in demeanor, and then disappearance. "Did he seem scared?" Mercer pressed. Logan hesitated. "Not scared exactly, more like uneasy, like he wasn't sure what to do." That was enough to warrant a subpoena for Ethan's phone records. As investigators delved deeper, they discovered Ethan's last known location, a cell tower ping near a desolate stretch of Old Mill Road, not far from where his car had been found. But there were no clear leads, no security footage, no witnesses, just a young man who had left a friend's house and never made it home. By the following morning, search teams were deployed, combing the area around the creek where his car had been discovered. Volunteers, family members, and even strangers joined the effort, trudging through damp underbrush, calling Ethan's name into the wind. Drones hovered overhead, scanning the dense forest for any trace of him. But the only thing they found was silence. Rachel Sullivan stood at the edge of the search site, arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. Her son was out there somewhere. She could feel it. But where? I just want him to come home, she whispered. I just want my baby back. As night fell and the search teams pulled back, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on everyone's shoulders. Ethan Sullivan had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but questions. Logan Mitchell had always been known as Ethan Sullivan's closest friend. They had grown up together, attended the same schools, and even shared plans for the future. But now, Logan found himself in a position he never expected, under scrutiny by the police. When detectives called him the morning after Ethan was reported missing, Logan's voice was unsteady. He admitted that he had been trying to contact Ethan as well, claiming he was just as worried as everyone else. He told police that Ethan had left his house around 10 p.m. and that he hadn't heard from him since. Detectives arrived at Logan's home later that evening. It was a modest, well-kept house, one that didn't appear out of place in the quiet neighborhood. Logan met them at the door, looking nervous. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, his foot tapping anxiously against the floor as he stepped aside to let them in.
We just need to go over a few things,
Detective Harper said, studying Logan carefully. Of course, Logan replied, his voice tight. Inside, the living room was neat, the coffee table cluttered with soda cans and an empty takeout box. Everything seemed normal, at least at first, but as the officers moved further inside, they began to notice small details that didn't sit right. A faint but undeniable chemical scent lingered in the air, something sharp and artificial. So, tell us about the night Ethan was here, Detective Mercer prompted, flipping open his notepad. Logan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. We hung out, watched some TV, had some beers, nothing crazy, but he wasn't feeling well. I think he drank too much. He puked in the bathroom, and then he said he needed to get some air. Next thing I know, he's gone. Gone? Mercer asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean he just walked out? Yeah, Logan said, shifting uncomfortably. I figured he'd just sit outside for a while, clear his head, but then he never came back in. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I didn't think much of it at the time. Harper exchanged a glance with Mercer. Something wasn't adding up. If Ethan had truly been sick, why would he leave without his car? And why hadn't Logan called someone sooner? We'd like to check Ethan's room, Harper said. Logan hesitated. His room? Yes, she said firmly. You said he was sick. Maybe he left something behind. Logan swallowed hard before nodding. Okay, it's upstairs. The detectives followed him up the narrow staircase, the air growing heavier with each step. When they reached the door to the guest room where Ethan had been staying, Logan hesitated before pulling out a key. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, but the moment they stepped inside, both officers froze. The scent of chemicals was overwhelming now, thick and suffocating. It was a sharp, acrid odor that clung to the walls, making their eyes water. And then they saw the floor. A large, dark stain stretched across the hardwood, unmistakably blood. Harper took a step forward, her hand instinctively moving toward the gun holstered at her hip. Mercer glanced at Logan, whose face had gone pale. What the hell is this? Mercer demanded. Logan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His breathing was shallow, his fingers trembling at his sides. We're going to need an explanation, Harper said, her voice cold. I don't know, Logan stammered. I swear, I don't know how that got there. Mercer moved cautiously around the room, his eyes scanning every inch. The bed was unmade, the blankets rumpled, as if someone had been tossing and turning. On the nightstand, a half-empty glass of water sat beside a phone charger, but Ethan's phone was nowhere in sight. Then, Harper spotted something else. Near the edge of the room, a small wastebasket had been overturned. Among the crumpled tissues and discarded fast food wrappers, something metallic caught the light. She crouched down, reaching for it with gloved hands. A key, a small silver key, stained with something dark and dried. Mercer looked at Logan sharply. What's this? I don't know, Logan whispered, his voice barely audible. Harper straightened, holding the key up. It's covered in blood. Logan took a step back. I swear, I have no idea what's happening. Maybe Ethan cut himself? Maybe he... Mercer interrupted. "You need to come with us." Logan's eyes widened. "Wait, you think I did something to him? That's insane. Ethan's my best friend." Harper exchanged another look with Mercer before pulling out her radio. "Dispatch, we need forensics at 132 Willow Creek Lane, possible crime scene." A crackle of static. "Then copy that, officers en route." Logan looked like he was about to collapse. His hands balled into fists, his breathing quick and uneven. "You have to believe me," he pleaded. "I didn't hurt Ethan, I swear." But as the officers secured the scene, it was clear that this case was no longer just a simple disappearance. Something terrible had happened in this house. The tension inside Logan Mitchell's house had reached its breaking point. The moment Detective Harper called in forensics, Logan's face drained of color. His eyes darted from the bloodstain on the floor to the key in Harper's gloved hand. Something in his expression shifted, an instinctual panic, the kind that came when fight or flight took over, and Logan chose flight. Before either officer could react, Logan bolted. He shoved past Mercer, knocking the detective off balance, and sprinted for the back door. Harper cursed, reaching for her radio, but by the time she barked an order, Logan had already thrown open the door and leaped off the porch. "Logan, stop!" Mercer yelled, scrambling to regain his footing. But Logan was already gone, his feet pounding against the cold November ground as he raced toward the backyard fence. It was 6 feet tall, wooden, weathered from years of sun and rain. He reached it in 3 desperate strides, grabbed the top rail, and hoisted himself over in a single frantic motion. The fence rattled under his weight before he dropped onto the other side, disappearing into the dense brush beyond. "Damn it!" Harper shouted, bolting after him. Mercer was right behind her, drawing his radio to alert the rest of the department. "Suspect on foot?" Mitchell just fled on foot, heading westbound behind Willow Creek Lane. "Need all available units." The chase begins. Logan was fast. Adrenaline had kicked in, propelling him forward through backyards, over garden walls, and through a narrow alley between 2 houses. The neighborhood was quiet, but porch lights flickered on as residents peered out, startled by the commotion. By the time Mercer and Harper cleared the fence, Logan had a 30-yard lead. He weaved through a line of hedges, disappearing onto a small wooded path that led toward the edge of town. "Spread out!" Harper commanded as more officers arrived. "He can't have gone far." The night swallowed Logan as he ran. The woods were thick, tangled with underbrush that clawed at his clothes, branches snapping underfoot. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning his lungs, but he didn't slow down. He had no plan, only the desperate need to get away. The search intensifies. Behind him, the sound of sirens grew louder. Flashlights cut through the trees as officers combed the area, their voices sharp commands piercing the night. Logan ducked behind a fallen log, his chest heaving as he tried to quiet his breathing. They were everywhere. And yet, after an hour of searching, Logan was still nowhere to be found. The Rome Police Department launched a full-scale manhunt. Officers scoured the area, knocking on doors, questioning anyone who might have seen Logan. Helicopters with infrared sensors hovered overhead, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. But Logan was gone. By dawn, the search had expanded beyond the immediate area. Police set up checkpoints on the major roads, watching for any sign that Logan had tried to leave town. His face was plastered across every news station, his name flooding social media. People had already begun to speculate, was Logan running because he was guilty, or was he scared of something else? With no leads on his whereabouts, the police turned to the one person who might be able to help, his father. A call to Thomas Mitchell. Detective Mercer arrived at the Mitchell residence just after sunrise. The house was on the outskirts of town, a large 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch. Thomas Mitchell, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a stern expression, answered the door. He didn't look surprised to see the police. "What's this about?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but guarded. "Mr. Mitchell, your son Logan fled during our investigation last night," Mercer said, cutting to the chase. "We need to find him." Thomas's expression darkened. "I heard." "Have you spoken to him?" Mercer asked, studying the man's face carefully. Thomas hesitated just for a moment, but Mercer caught it. "No," he said finally. "I haven't." Mercer narrowed his eyes. You sure about that?" Thomas exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but my son isn't a criminal. If he ran, there's a reason." "He left behind a room full of blood," Mercer countered. "That's not exactly the act of an innocent man." Thomas's jaw tightened. "If Logan did something wrong, he'll have to face it, but I won't turn my back on my son." "If you know anything, you need to tell us," Mercer pressed. "This isn't just about Logan. Ethan Sullivan is missing, and we need to know if Logan is involved." Thomas held Mercer's gaze for a long moment before stepping back and closing the door without another word. Mercer sighed. This was going to be a long, long hunt. The Mitchell residence stood silent in the pale morning light, an eerie stillness settling over the farmhouse. Inside, Thomas Mitchell sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the worn wood surface. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, disbelief. His son was missing, fleeing from the police, and now Thomas had found something that changed everything. Logan's phone. It had been in the small storage room near the back of the house, tucked between old tools and boxes of forgotten belongings. Thomas hadn't been searching for it. He had simply been trying to clear his mind, pacing the house, hoping for some kind of clarity. And then, in the dim light, he saw it. The black phone sat atop a dusty workbench, its screen dark. He reached for it hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the smooth glass. It was still warm. His heart pounded. A terrifying discovery. Thomas pressed the power button. The phone came to life, casting an eerie glow on his face. A wave of missed calls and text messages flooded the screen, detectives, friends, even news outlets looking for a statement. But it was something else that caught his attention. A note. The title read simply, "To-Do List." With trembling fingers, Thomas opened the file. The first few lines seemed innocent enough. Pack a bag, withdraw cash, ditch the car. But as he scrolled, his breath hitched, the words changed. Clean up the mess in the room, get rid of evidence, make sure no one finds Ethan. His blood ran cold. It got worse. The next file he found was labeled Details, and what he read shook him to his core. It was a long, disturbingly meticulous description of a crime, a sequence of actions, each step laid out with precision. Descriptions of the struggle, the exact moment Ethan's breathing had stopped, the weight of silence afterward. Thomas felt sick. This wasn't fear or suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. A change of heart. For hours, Thomas sat at the table, staring at the phone. He ran through every possible scenario, every way he could protect Logan, every way he could explain this away. But there was no excuse for what he had just read. By midday, he made his decision. With shaking hands, he picked up his own phone and dialed the number for the Rome Police Department. The line rang only once before Detective Mercer answered. "Mitchell?" Mercer's voice was sharp, expectant. Thomas swallowed hard. "I need you to come over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found something." Within 20 minutes, Mercer and Harper were at the house. Thomas let them in without a word and led them straight to the kitchen. He placed Logan's phone on the table between them and took a step back, as if the device itself were cursed. Mercer picked it up carefully, his eyes meeting Thomas's. "Where did you find this?" "In the back room," Thomas said, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't even looking for it, but it was there, and you need to see what's on it." Harper wasted no time navigating through the phone's files with practiced efficiency. Her face remained unreadable until she reached the notes. Then her jaw tightened. "Jesus Christ," she muttered under her breath. Mercer leaned in, reading over her shoulder. The room fell into a suffocating silence as they absorbed what was written. Every line, every gruesome detail, it was all there. Logan had planned this. He had thought it through, step by step, and now he was on the run. Implications and action. Harper locked the phone and exhaled sharply. This changes everything. Mercer turned to Thomas. Did you read this? Thomas nodded stiffly. I did, and that's why I called you. His voice cracked. I don't know what to do anymore. Mercer studied him carefully. You did the right thing by calling us. This is damning evidence, but it also gives us something to work with. Harper was already pulling out her radio. Dispatch, we need a warrant to track Logan Mitchell's last known locations via his phone records. We have confirmed evidence linking him to Ethan Sullivan's disappearance. Suspect is now considered extremely dangerous. The weight of those words settled over the room. Thomas closed his eyes, his fingers trembling against his forehead. His son was now a fugitive, and there was no turning back. Logan Mitchell had been running for days, his mind a relentless storm of fear, regret, and desperation. He had seen his face on every news station, heard his name whispered in every corner of town. There was nowhere left to hide. The manhunt had turned relentless, and the pressure was unbearable. He had no choice left but to face the inevitable. It was just past midnight when Thomas Mitchell made the call to the Rome Police Department. His voice was quiet, strained. My son wants to turn himself in. We're coming to the station. Detective Mercer and Detective Harper were already waiting when the Mitchell family arrived at the precinct. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Logan stepped inside, his hoodie pulled low over his face. His mother, Carolyn, gripped his arm as if afraid he might run again. His father stood rigid, his expression unreadable. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across Logan's face as he walked to the front desk. Officers nearby stopped what they were doing, the room falling silent as the most wanted man in town surrendered himself without a word. Logan Mitchell? Mercer asked, stepping forward. Logan lifted his gaze, his eyes hollow. Yeah. You're under arrest for the suspected murder of Ethan Sullivan, Mercer said, his voice steady but firm. You have the right to remain silent. I want a lawyer, Logan interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion. Mercer barely blinked. That's your right. Harper stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Logan's own shoulder before guiding him toward the interrogation room. He moved without resistance, his steps sluggish, his body slumped as if the weight of everything had finally crushed him. His mother's quiet sobs echoed down the hall as the door shut behind them. The interrogation that went nowhere. The room was cold, the walls a dull gray, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Logan sat motionless in the metal chair, his hands cuffed in front of him. Across from him, Detective Harper leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. You know why you're here, she said, her voice calm but firm. Logan didn't respond. He stared at the scratched surface of the table, his fingers twitching slightly. Mercer sighed. We have your phone, Logan. We've seen the notes. We know what you did. Still, Logan remained silent. Harper slid a photograph across the table, a picture of Ethan smiling, full of life. Tell us what happened. Give his family some peace. Logan's tightened, but he didn't speak. His breathing remained steady, controlled. His request for a lawyer meant they wouldn't get anything from him tonight. Fine, Mercer finally said, standing. But we're not done. Thomas Mitchell's decision. While Logan refused to cooperate, his father made a different choice. Hours later, Thomas sat across from Mercer and Harper in another interview room, his hands clasped together. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face deeper than ever. I found something else, he admitted, his voice rough. I know where Ethan is. Mercer and Harper exchanged glances, leaning in. Go on, Mercer urged. Thomas exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Logan used to go camping out near Red Creek Trail. There's an old, abandoned hunting cabin about 2 miles in. It's isolated, no one goes there anymore. If he wanted to hide something, that's where he'd go. Harper's eyes darkened. And you didn't tell us this before because I needed to be sure, Thomas admitted, his voice breaking. I needed to know my son wasn't capable of this. But after what I saw on that phone, I can't protect him anymore. If Ethan's body is out there, I want it found. Harper wasted no time. She stood, pulling out her radio. We need units at Red Creek Trail immediately. Possible location of the victim. Bring cadaver dogs and forensic teams. Thomas dropped his head into his hands as the detectives left the room. His son was in custody, but the real nightmare was only just beginning. The search begins. Within an hour, search teams had gathered at Red Creek Trail. The night was thick with fog, the moon casting an eerie glow over the trees. Officers moved in a tight formation, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices low and tense. Cadaver dogs sniffed the air, their handlers whispering quiet commands as they led the search. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent a ripple of unease through the team. They all knew what they were about to find. And then, a dog barked sharply, pulling hard against its leash. The handler followed, his heart pounding. The dog stopped at the entrance of the cabin, whining, scratching at the door. Mercer stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached for the doorknob, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open. The stench hit them immediately. Inside, the cabin was dark, damp, untouched by time. Dust floated in the air, caught in the beams of their flashlights. And there in the corner of the room, covered haphazardly by a tarp, lay what they had feared. A body. Mercer's stomach clenched. We found him. The radio crackled to life, Harper's voice cutting through the silence. Tell the Sullivan family we found Ethan. The silence of guilt. Back at the station, Logan sat in his cell, puffed, staring at the wall. He knew what had just happened. He knew they had found Ethan, but he still didn't say a word. Dahil, Zuiday Lanoidung Bat Nuko, Dugwin Huan Tuan. The search for Ethan Sullivan had reached a grim conclusion. After following the lead provided by Thomas Mitchell, police teams arrived at an isolated cemetery just outside of town. The site was old, forgotten by most, surrounded by thick woods that made it nearly invisible from the main road. Moonlight cast long shadows between the gravestones, giving the area an eerie stillness. The wind carried the distant sound of rustling leaves as officers moved methodically across the uneven ground. Cadaver dogs had already been searching the area, their handlers guiding them between the rows of weathered tombstones. Then, a sharp bark cut through the silence, signaling a discovery. A handler rushed forward, the dog pawing aggressively at a patch of recently disturbed earth near the far end of the cemetery. Detective Mercer's heart pounded as he stepped closer. The ground was loose, the soil still slightly damp. Someone had been here recently. "Start digging," he ordered, his voice grim. Officers moved quickly, shovels biting into the earth. With each layer removed, the stench of decay grew stronger, making some of the officers turn away to cover their noses. Mercer and Harper remained, their eyes locked on the shallow grave as something pale emerged from the soil. A bedsheet. A faded blue bedsheet, the fabric dirt-streaked and torn, matching the linen from Logan Mitchell's home. Harper clenched her jaw as she recognized it immediately. With careful precision, officers continued their work, uncovering more of the wrapped bundle. When they finally lifted it from the grave, the sheet unfurled slightly, revealing what they had all feared: Ethan Sullivan's lifeless body. A heavy silence fell over the group. Mercer let out a slow breath, his hands tightening into fists. The confirmation was devastating, but it was also the proof they needed. Logan had done this. There was no longer any doubt. Harper turned away for a moment, composing herself before speaking into her radio. "We've found the victim. Notify the Sullivan family." The words felt heavy. They had found Ethan, but it was far too late. Processing the crime scene, forensics teams moved in, carefully documenting the scene. Photographs were taken from every angle, soil samples collected, and the body examined for any immediate signs of trauma. The sheet was pulled back further, revealing bruising around Ethan's neck and a deep wound near his temple. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear, but the injuries suggested a violent struggle. Harper shook her head. He didn't just try to hide him, he wanted to erase him. Mercer exhaled sharply, and he almost got away with it. The cemetery's isolation made it a perfect dumping ground. Logan must have assumed no one would think to look here. It was far enough from his home and any major roads, and the disturbed soil blended in with the natural erosion of the old graves. But now, it was the key piece of evidence that sealed his fate. As the body was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, Mercer pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He hesitated for just a second before hitting dial. The Sullivan family's grief. Rachel Sullivan's voice was barely a whisper when she answered. Hello? Mercer closed his eyes briefly before speaking. Mrs. Sullivan, we found Ethan. A pause, then a shaky breath. Is he? Mercer swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm so sorry, he's gone. A muffled sob, the sound of the phone being passed. Then Greg Sullivan's voice, strained but controlled. Where? A cemetery outside of town. We're still processing the scene. We'll need to conduct a full examination, but we have no doubt it's him. There was silence on the other end, then a quiet, broken response. Thank you for finding him. Mercer didn't know what else to say. No words would ever be enough. Logan's fate is sealed. Back at the precinct, Logan Mitchell sat in his holding cell, staring at the wall. He hadn't spoken since he was booked. Not to the officers, not to his parents, not even to his lawyer. But when the door opened and Detective Harper stepped inside, carrying a single photograph, the image of Ethan's body being pulled from the grave, something in Logan shifted. His eyes flickered, his jaw tensed. She placed the photo on the table and slid it toward him. We found him. Logan's fingers twitched, his breath catching for just a second. But he didn't speak. Harper leaned forward. You can stay silent all you want, but we have your phone. We have the notes. We have the body. It's over, Logan. Still no response. Harper sighed, standing up. Enjoy the silence while it lasts. The jury won't be so forgiving. She left him alone with the photo, letting reality sink in. Outside the room, Mercer watched through the observation window, arms crossed. He won't talk. Harper shook her head. He doesn't have to. The evidence speaks for itself. Mercer nodded. Then let's make sure Ethan gets the justice he deserves. As Logan sat alone in his cell, the weight of his actions finally settled over him. And for the first time since the night Ethan disappeared, he looked afraid. The trial of Logan Mitchell began on the morning of July 18, 2024. The courthouse in Rome, Georgia, was packed with reporters, family members, and concerned citizens. The case had captivated the community. The brutality of Ethan Sullivan's murder leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had followed the investigation. Now, after months of waiting, justice was finally within reach. Logan was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled in front of him. His once confident demeanor had faded, replaced by a hollow stare. He barely acknowledged his parents, who sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and shame. The prosecution wasted no time. District Attorney Rachel Dunham laid out the case in painstaking detail, walking the jury through every piece of damning evidence. Logan's phone notes, the blood-stained sheets, the location of Ethan's grave. She played audio recordings of Logan's initial police interview, highlighting his evasiveness. Every fact, every revelation painted a picture of cold, calculated murder. This was not an accident, Dunham declared, her voice firm. This was not a crime of passion. Logan Mitchell planned this. He carried it out. And then he tried to erase Ethan Sullivan from existence, but he failed. And now justice must be served. The defense's struggle, Logan's defense attorney, Matthew Calloway, faced an uphill battle. Knowing the evidence was overwhelming, he pivoted to an insanity defense, arguing that Logan had suffered a severe psychotic break that rendered him incapable of understanding his actions. Logan Mitchell was not in his right mind, Calloway insisted. He was not the young man his family and friends knew. He was spiraling into a state of severe mental distress. What happened to Ethan Sullivan was a tragic, horrifying consequence of that mental collapse. The prosecution, however, was ready for this argument. They called on forensic psychologists who had examined Logan post-arrest. Their conclusion was unanimous. Logan had been fully aware of his actions. He had shown no signs of psychosis leading up to the crime. In fact, his meticulous planning, his notes, his cleanup efforts, his escape, proved the exact opposite. Logan Mitchell knew exactly what he was doing. One expert testified. His actions demonstrate clear intent and awareness of the consequences. The judge, Honorable Marcus Reynolds, listened intently as both sides presented their arguments. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Logan's own words, written in his phone, sealed his fate. Chashak the verdict. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to speak. We, the jury, Find the defendant, Logan Mitchell, guilty of first-degree murder. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Logan remained motionless, his face devoid of emotion, as if the reality of his fate hadn't fully sunk in. Judge Reynolds wasted no time in delivering the sentence. Logan Mitchell, you have committed an unthinkable crime. You not only took a life, but you attempted to cover it up, evade justice, and deny a grieving family their right to the truth. The court finds no mitigating factors in your case. Therefore, I am sentencing you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Logan's mother let out a quiet sob, clutching her husband's hand. Ethan's parents held each other tightly, their relief tempered by the weight of their loss. As Logan was escorted from the courtroom, he finally looked up, just once. His eyes met his father's, but Thomas Mitchell gave no sign of recognition. His son had made his choice, and now he would pay the price. Aftermath. The Sullivan family addressed the media outside the courthouse, their emotions raw but resolute. Ethan was a kind, brilliant young man with a future ahead of him, Greg Sullivan said. We will never get to see what he could have become, but today at least we have justice. As the courtroom emptied and the town of Rome began to move forward, one thing was certain: no one would ever forget the tragic case of Ethan Sullivan and the fate of Logan Mitchell. The Sullivan family had been clinging to hope, no matter how small, that Ethan would be found alive. But when Detective Mercer arrived at their home with the news, that fragile hope shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Rachel Sullivan opened the door, her face pale, eyes hollow from sleepless nights of worry. Greg Sullivan stood behind her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. The moment they saw Mercer's expression, they knew. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, Mercer began, his voice heavy with the burden of his words. I'm so sorry to have to tell you this. We found Ethan. Rachel's knees buckled, a strangled cry escaping her lips as Greg caught her before she collapsed completely. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No, please, no. Greg held his wife tightly, his face contorted in grief. Where? His voice was barely more than a breath. Near an old cemetery outside of town, Mercer said gently. We have reason to believe Logan Mitchell was responsible. Rachel sobbed, clutching at Greg's shirt as if holding on to him would anchor her to reality. Logan? No, that can't be. He was his best friend. He was supposed to protect him. Greg's face darkened, his grief momentarily overridden by the searing betrayal. That boy was in my house. He sat at my table. His voice broke. He killed my son? Mercer nodded solemnly. I'm so sorry. We have the evidence. We'll make sure he faces justice. Ethan had always been the golden boy, bright, ambitious, full of life. He had been set to start a new job at a top engineering firm in Atlanta, his hard work and dedication paying off in ways that made his parents beam with pride. Rachel sat on the couch later that night, scrolling through old pictures on her phone, sobbing quietly with every image that flashed before her. Ethan at his high school graduation, grinning in his cap and gown. Ethan as a child, sitting on his father's shoulders at a summer fair. Ethan at Christmas, unwrapping presents with that same boyish excitement he never quite outgrew. Greg sat beside her, silent and still, staring at the framed photo of Ethan on the mantel. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he murmured. He had his whole life ahead of him. Rachel wiped her tears with trembling hands. I don't know how we're supposed to go on without him. A town in mourning. News of Ethan's death spread quickly through Rome, Georgia. Candlelight vigils were organized in his honor, with dozens of people gathering in the town square, holding pictures of Ethan, sharing stories of his kindness, his intelligence, his bright spirit. His former classmates and teachers from Berry College spoke about his passion for engineering, his endless curiosity, and his ever-present smile. Friends who had known him since childhood talked about his love for hiking, his goofy sense of humor, the way he always knew how to lift someone's spirits. But there was an underlying theme in every speech, every tribute, a question that no one could answer. Why? Why had Logan done this? How could he have turned on someone who had once been like a brother to him? What had driven him to commit such a senseless, brutal act? Grief turns to resolve. As the days passed, Rachel and Greg found themselves consumed by both grief and determination. They wouldn't let Ethan's death be just another tragic story. They vowed to turn their pain into action, creating the Ethan Sullivan Foundation to support young students pursuing engineering, an initiative that Ethan would have been proud of. At the foundation's launch event, Rachel stood before a crowd of supporters, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to consume her. "Ethan was taken from us in the cruelest way imaginable," she said, "but we will not let his light be extinguished. Through this foundation, we will carry on his dreams, his kindness, his legacy. This is how we keep him alive." Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding in agreement. "We refuse to let this be the end of Ethan's story." The pain of their loss would never fully fade, but in honoring Ethan's memory, they found a way to move forward, one step at a time. The tragic case of Ethan Sullivan and Logan Mitchell left an indelible mark on the town of Rome, Georgia. Beyond the courtroom verdict, beyond the grief-stricken family and a community forever changed, the case served as a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath even the closest relationships. The illusion of trust. Ethan and Logan had been inseparable for years, best friends since childhood, their bond forged through shared experiences and dreams. No one, not even Ethan's parents, could have foreseen the darkness that lay beneath Logan's surface. This case emphasized a painful truth. Sometimes the people we trust most can be the ones who betray us in the most horrifying ways. The lesson here is not to live in fear, but to remain vigilant. Friendship is built on trust, but trust should never be blind. Ignoring warning signs, no matter how small, can be dangerous. In hindsight, Logan had exhibited troubling behavior, withdrawn moments, flashes of anger, an obsessive need for control that Ethan may have overlooked. Recognizing these signs early can be the key to preventing tragedy. The importance of seeking help. Mental health is often overlooked or stigmatized, but cases like this highlight its significance. While Logan's defense attempted to claim insanity, psychological evaluations revealed that he was fully aware of his actions. However, it also became evident that he had harbored deep-seated resentment and possible untreated mental struggles. This case serves as a call to action. Mental health should never be ignored. If someone exhibits troubling behavior, whether it's drastic mood swings, violent tendencies, or concerning thoughts, intervention is crucial. Friends, family, and communities must encourage open dialogue and ensure that those struggling receive the help they need before it's too late. The pursuit of justice. Justice was served, but it came at a devastating cost. Ethan's family received closure through the conviction of Logan, but no prison sentence could bring back their beloved son. The legal system ensured accountability, but the emotional wounds remained open. For law enforcement, this case underscored the importance of thorough investigations, forensic evidence, and perseverance. Detectives followed every lead, uncovering the chilling details that secured Logan's conviction. This level of diligence must remain the standard in criminal justice, ensuring that no case is left unresolved. A community forever changed. Rome, Georgia is a town that prides itself on its sense of community, but Ethan's murder fractured that unity. It served as a wake-up call, a reminder that darkness can seep into even the safest of places. In the months following the trial, schools and organizations in the area began implementing stronger mental health awareness programs and self-defense education, hoping to prevent such tragedies in the future. The Sullivan family's resilience turned their loss into a mission. Through the Ethan Sullivan Foundation, they dedicated themselves to helping young students pursue their dreams, ensuring that Ethan's legacy lived on in the aspirations of others. They refused to let his name be defined by his death, but instead by the hope he had embodied in life. A final reflection. As time moves forward, the pain remains, but so does the lesson. Always be aware, always listen to your instincts, and never underestimate the potential dangers, even from those closest to you. Ethan's story is a tragedy, but through awareness and vigilance, it can also serve as a safeguard for others. His life was taken, but his memory stands as a reminder that justice, awareness, and action must always prevail.